Welcome to the shop. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video I've got one of the most ridiculous things I've ever created. It's MODOK. For those that are not familiar with the character, he's a supervillain within the Marvel Universe, but he has a TV series coming out on Hulu, and it's going to be a comedy-based series with Patton Oswalt as the voice of MODOK. Now, this particular build is made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and I have a free PDF file on my website in case you would like to build your own MODOK helmet. And why would you want to do such a thing? Well, you could have an awesome casual cosplay at your next convention or your next super professional Zoom meeting. So I want to show you what it takes to put this MODOK helmet together. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing is to take part A and transfer that onto some 6mm HD foam. Now you can change the width or the height of this piece to fit your face properly. Go ahead and trace and cut out parts B and C out of 6mm foam. I use a heat gun to lightly heat up the foam so that I can give all of these pieces a gradual curve. Weldwood contact cement is applied to the sides of all the pieces. After the contact cement has dried, all the pieces can be firmly pressed together, and you can see how these three pieces give us the base shape for the helmet. Part D will wrap all the way around the bottom of the helmet, so if you changed any of the scales, you can measure this so that the strip wraps around correctly. So part D is traced onto some 6mm foam, and it has a slight bevel at the top and the bottom. So I sand away the foam to achieve this using my Dremel rotary tool. This strip is supposed to look like it has a bunch of different little segments, so I mark out 1-inch increments. Then using a hobby knife and a heat gun, I open the foam up to give it a more defined look. The strip can now be glued around the bottom, and I make sure that my seam segment is located in the back. To detail around the face and the back of the helmet, I'm going to be using some 10mm HD foam half-round dowels. These half-round dowels look great and they work really well just using some Bob Smith superglue. Now because my dowels are 36 inches in length, they can wrap all the way around the outside of this helmet and be completely seamless. I go ahead and use another dowel as a marker for my next step down. When I get to the opposite edge, it's cut at a slight angle and then glued down just to give it a better transition. Okay, here's where I messed up, and I actually added one too many dowels. But that's the great thing about foam. You can either redo it again or peel it off, sand it down, and it's good to go. So I go ahead and I knock it down with a Dremel and I transfer part E onto some 2mm foam. On this piece, make sure to extend it about 2 inches past what I have on the template. That way you have enough material to cut away. I go ahead and I apply some contact cement to part E and the back of the helmet. After part E had been glued down, I move on to part F, and it's the same process. I use some contact cement for the middle, and I use some Bob Smith super glue around the outside of the perimeter. Here you can see the extra material that I was talking about, and I line it up close to the half-round dowel, mark it, and then cut it away. Now if you didn't want to go to all this trouble to make these segments, you could just score them and open them up with a heat gun. You can see how I use part F to wrap around the front to cover up that front seam. Part G is traced and cut out of some 2mm foam 2 times. With these two pieces being applied to the top of the helmet, I cut away the excess, but I leave a small gap in the middle for the jewel. For the jewel, part H and I are transferred onto some 4mm foam. These are cut out and rounded over with a rotary tool before being glued to the top of the helmet. Part J is applied in between the two half rounds on the front of the helmet, and I use my rotary tool to smooth out all the seams and round everything over. Part K is traced and cut out of some 2mm foam. This is glued into place and any additional material can be cut away. Part L is traced and cut out of some 2mm foam 2 times, and those are glued right under part K. The small strip of part M is cut out of some 2mm foam and glued right under part K. Part N is also cut out of some 2mm foam and glued right on top of part M. Now part O might be a little bit difficult. You want to cut it out and score it, and then use your heat gun to open that score line up. With part P, I score the interior detail lines first, and then use my heat gun to open those up. Then I can cut away all the additional material and glue that onto part J. I then cut out 4 tiny little squares, and I glue those to the bottom of part P. As for those little squares, I cut out a whole bunch more, and at the bottom of every one of those 1-inch segments, I glue another one of the little squares. Moving on to the back of the helmet, I cut out parts Q and R from some 2mm foam. Using the basic template to get these all lined up, these can now be glued into place. To make his arms and legs, I'm going to be using some 20mm HD foam round dowels. These dowels are cut out into about 4-inch strips and then cut at an angle to simulate the elbow joint. Once glued, it can be cleaned up with a rotary tool. Go ahead and take part S and transfer that onto some 2mm foam and cut it out. This can now be glued onto his forearm. With part T, you want to cut this out of the foam, but you also want to make sure to score the middle of it. This detail line will open up later on when heat is applied. Part T can now be glued to approximately where his shoulder will be. The same process can be applied to part U. This piece is just a little bit longer because it's going to wrap around his wrist. To make his tiny hands, I cut a 20mm dowel in half. Then I was able to sketch on and cut through exactly where his fingers would be. Now there's too much material in here, so I used my rotary tool to remove some of that so that his fingers could curl under. The heat gun helps smooth over and separate everything, and then I could use some super glue to curl the fingers into a fist. Now I'm still missing his thumb, so I took a little piece of cut off dowel and I glued a thumb into place. To refine the top and the knuckle, I once again used my rotary tool. Now he's got these little circular details on the tops of all of his knuckles, so I used a 5mm hole punch. For the back of the hand, I cut out a small square of 2mm foam, scored it, and then glued it into place. I cut the dowel at an angle for his arm to sit next to the helmet, and then I held that arm into place and positioned the hand to see what would look best. Once both arms are completed, I use my heat gun to seal the foam and open up all the scores that I put in earlier. His tiny arms could now be glued onto either side of the helmet. After looking at it, I wasn't happy with the position of his left arm, so I took some scissors and I chopped it off. This allowed me to glue it in a different position that I liked a lot better. The same process of cutting the dowels at an angle to represent his knees is repeated for the legs. Now the dowels for his legs taper in quite a bit down to his shoes, so I achieved that by removing some of the foam with my Dremel rotary tool. 2 more strips of part T are then cut for his legs. The top 2 strips on his legs will have a score in them, just like the arms, but the bottom 2 strips that represent the top of his boot will not. Just like the arms, the legs are cut at an angle and then glued onto the front of the helmet. Similar to how I made the hands, I took more 20mm dowels, cut them down, and refined them to make his feet. To replicate the soles of his shoes, I traced around his feet onto some 4mm foam. These were then cut out and glued down, and I could just use my rotary tool to get the correct shape. He has some small detail lines going across the top of his shoes, and I cut those in using my hobby knife. The heat gun can now smooth out those shoes as well as open up the cuts. The shoes can now be glued to the bottom of his legs. Part B is traced onto some 4mm foam and another small circle is glued in the middle. This piece can now be glued directly under the jewel. Now I'm going to add some hair to the face area to match the show, but if you didn't want to do this step, that's fine. I go ahead and take part W and transfer that onto some 4mm foam. After it had been cut out, I then use my rotary tool to round over the strands of hair. I use a heat gun to seal this piece and then I can glue it right to the back of part B. Plasti-Dip will be used to seal the foam, and in this case I did 2 light coats. After the Plasti-Dip had cured, I sprayed on some Krylon red oxide primer. This gives me a great base for the gold. Montana Metal Effect Gold was then sprayed over the red oxide primer, and you can tell that the red really gives it a richer color. After all the spray paint's cured, it's time to start hand painting, and for the darker gold I'm going to be using a mixture of Golden Brand Iridescent Bronze and FX Gauntlet. Mixing the FX with the Golden Brand did thin it out, so I had to do 2 coats of this particular color. For his arms and legs, I'm going to be doing FX brand Voodoo Violet. Same thing with the gauntlet. I really like the color, but the paint was pretty thin. What I should have done was paint a heavy body acrylic first and then painted this color on top. One way to speed this up was to use my hairdryer in between layers. With the purple and dark gold taken care of, I can now start painting the darker areas. And to do that, I'm going to be using Liquitex brand Mars Black. This paint was applied into the recesses with a small detail brush, trying to match the show. I taped off around parts Q and R to add some black paint. This was easier than having the foam cut away as a recess. Now the thing here is if you're taping off over acrylics, make sure to grab some tape that has a very light tack. That, or you can take your tape and press it onto your work surface a couple of times to remove some of the adhesive, which is what I usually tend to do. The same Mars Black was also applied as a base layer on his hair. To paint his jewel, I started off with some cadmium-free Liquitex Red Medium. This was mixed with some of the Mars Black just to knock it down a little bit. This mixture was applied to both jewels and the small detail piece on his front. Next, the Mars Black was painted onto the lower corner of the jewel to act as a shadow. Then some straight cadmium red was painted in the opposite corner and feathered out. Utrecht brand titanium white and some small detail brushes were used to paint highlights on the jewels. To match the look of the show, some burnt sienna was painted onto the highlights of the hair. So you can see the steps that I took to put together my own MODOK helmet. And again, if you'd like to build your own, I have a free PDF file over on my website, so download that and build right along with the video. And if you are building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.